Well, good afternoon. Hey,
Good.
Brent.
Hey, hey.
Thanks for another little, what is this? It's another little step on our journey around the adaptive capacity index. Today, thought we could dive into immunity to change. I think this is a concept that came to me many, many years ago under the guise of an organizational immune response or an organizational immune reaction. So, but even at that stage, it intuitively made sense to me. Uh, but maybe that's just because I got a biology background, right? So, um, the 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 thing that got me interested in this is like coming forwards and seeing where Keegan took this, so the depth of this. So yeah, look, I thought we'd take see if we can grab 45 minutes today and see if we can do a bit of a blast through uh, this framework. I guess my first thing is where did you come across it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the way it went was I was working for a little consultancy, really where I did my apprenticeship, I suppose, of the kind of work that I've ended up doing for the rest of my career. And that was particularly the application of psychology, therapeutic skills, models, modalities, but into an organizational context. And at that time, which was the early 2000s, the early noughties, um, that was a bit controversial, and a lot of people were a bit freaked out by it.
Why
The
were they freaked out?
Well, I think the overarching sentiment I heard at the time was this doesn't belong in business. This what you're doing has nothing to do with business. That's personal. That belongs somewhere else. You do that somewhere else. It doesn't belong here. And it's kind of like that, leave your problems at the door. Or somehow you're supposed to go to work, put on a mask, put on the suit, you know, keep everything bottled up with the tie, whatever that meaning was. Of There's a professional way of behaving, there's a certain, and you put that on and you do work, and then you go home and you do whatever else you do, and never the twain shall meet. And if you have any other stuff going on in your life, like divorces or deaths or births, or, well, that's also irrelevant, and leave that also. So anyway, it's kind of an extension of that mentality. And so the idea of you would bring in the whole person was kind of where this was coming from. So look, it was in that context, and we were at that time talking about levels of thinking. And Keegan is first and foremost a researcher and educator at Harvard around adult education and adult development. And so that's where I first ran into him. We used his framework. He first started to talk about it in a book, I think, called In Over Your Head, which was talking about the growth of adult capability and complexity of mind in order to be able to solve problems. And the In Over Your Head piece, he was pointing to the very common, and I think we've all seen it, experience of self or seeing somebody else in a job and they're in over their head. The work that they need to do is more complex than their capability to do it. And of course that feels horrible, but he put some thinking and research and theory behind, well, what's going on there. And it's not, his proposition was, it wasn't that they didn't have enough knowledge or skill. Often they did. It was the vertical component as opposed to horizontal skilling. It was a vertical skilling around complexity of thinking, complexity of mind. And that's where I first ran into him. And in that sense, he had uh, a few levels of thinking, layers of thinking defined. There was kind of an adolescent level of thinking that everyone goes through as a teenager. And then there was the adult level of thinking, which he called socialized. Um, and then he started to define other levels of thinking that were beyond kind of normal socialized. And he talked about the ways to climb, I suppose, up into what goes on mentally for people when they transition from one level of thinking to the next. That's why I ran into him.
As you mentioned that, I my first response was people resistance to this. Like, how could anybody be resistant to the idea that, hey, there are processes going on inside of people that make them resistant to change, right? But then at the same, yeah, leave your leave your personal life at home. Yeah, but that's okay. Leave your personal life at home, but then, just operate from your head up. Uh, but then when you said that, I was like, oh yeah, that was me. You don't have to go back too far in my history. Go back a decade. That is exactly who I was. It's like, yeah, that's what you need to deal with at home. By the way, we've got a job to do, so can you just get on with it? Uh,
Yeah,
so
right.
it is interesting how much. Yeah, it's interesting how much people could change. That's interesting. So, okay. So for the uninitiated, broadly speaking, what is immunity to change?
So having been introduced to Keegan and his idea of adult development, and that there were phases to go through, I started to get interested in, well, how do you move from one to the next? What's that about? And I started looking at his stuff, and I happened upon this book, which I think got published in about 2001, called something along the lines of how you change the way you talk and change the way we work, or something very much like that. How you change the way you talk and change the way you work, or something like that. Really weird, awkward title. He's, of course, American, and so he's got quite a folksy way of talking and writing, and so he can come up with some of these things that seem a bit odd. Anyway, in there, he starts to describe personal languages, individual languages, he calls them, as opposed to collective languages. He's talking about reframing how we describe aspects of our experience and what's going on, and how that reframing, the redescription, can actually help us get unstuck. He developed that further in a book called Immunity to Change, which was published I don't know, about 10 years later. And that's where I think it really kind of came to fruition, and where a lot of this work we've picked up. So the immunity to change process that he and Lisa Lasko-Leahy set out together is it's a thinking process where you're guided through several reflective steps, which take you deeper each step, in terms of understanding how is it that you're not doing the thing you think you should be doing, or how is it that you're stuck in a situation that you don't want to be in? How is it that you remain in these situations and in these patterns of behavior that you actively know you don't want to be in, and yet you seemingly can do nothing about? The way he
Okay,
starts a lot
sorry,
of this,
that resonates. I'm sure that
well,
resonates with
so
so many people.
well, that's it, right? So this is the how come I can't lose weight? This is how come I can't stop smoking? This is how come I can't drink less? How it's all of those things, but it's also, if you think about it in say a workplace context, it's, oh, I really should have spoke up then. I mean, I just did that again. I just kept myself silent, or I really shouldn't have blown up then, or whatever it is. It's like those patterns that we get into. It's like, oh, I did it again. Why did I do that again?
Is this one of those internal or individual languages you spoke of?
Well, it is. It's actually a combination of four of them. And so the way he initially presented this, it was as four discrete things, and then he put them all together. And they do belong together, and it forms a bit of a process. We've added a fifth step, and that's what we call our immunity to change process. In the adaptive capacity index, we talk about it in the positive as embracing change, as opposed to immunity to change in the negative. But that's the same thing.
You said there were four or maybe five things. What can you kind of?
Right. So we can do that. The first one is identifying really where you want to start. What's the presenting problem? So it can be one of two ways. Either it can be a complaint, I really hate it when, or it could be a statement about I would be better off or I would be happier if. But there's a statement about what you want, essentially, or what you don't want if it's a complaint. And so that's the first kind of one of those turns is it's identifying, well, what's the thing that's getting in the way? What's the thing that's pissing you off? The second turn, the second step is saying, well, all right, that's the case. And so here's what I wish were different. Here's what I want instead. Great, got that. Tick, step one. Step two would be, but what's my 50% in this? So I'm doing something or I'm not doing something that is contributing to the status quo. I'm doing something or I'm not doing something that's keeping me in this situation, that's keeping me here. What is it? And so there's a kind of recognition or an acknowledgement of our personal responsibility, our 50%. And the next step is actually where the immunity piece kicks in. The third step is saying, well, because if I were to do the thing I'm not doing, or if I weren't to do the thing I am doing, if I do the opposite of that, what am I imagining would happen? What do I think would be the consequence of that? And what am I afraid would be the impact on me of doing that? And so step three is always this little bit of a come to Jesus moment of, that's why I'm stuck. That's why I'm doing things, is because I'm actually afraid of something bad happening. And then the fourth step is, well, and so what's the big assumption that sits underneath that? If that bad thing were to occur, what's the ultimate implication of that? And so usually these things have a few layers to them. They usually have a bit of a peeling the onion thing. So sitting underneath that would be kind of a more fundamental fear around, well, if that were to occur, then this would happen. And that would be unsupportable.
Okay, so you do work with people at the group level, but then at the individual level, and you don't have to name names, of course. But I am curious, what are those? Are there things that often show up at that? Yeah, that deep underlying reason why people don't want to do it. Or like, what often comes up?
Oh, look at this stuff. If it's, and sometimes it takes a few goes, right? People are not used to necessarily operating in this way. And so again, it's like we have layers. All of us, we're made up of layers. And so peeling that back can take a bit of time. But I mean, I usually say something along the lines, there's only seven. And I don't know if there's actually seven. I'd actually have to write them all down and count them. But there's about seven things that all of humanity that I've run into, and I've done this with hundreds of people, seems to land on. And they are the very basic underlying fears that all of us hold. You can go back to someone like a Maslow or others but it's about love and not being loved. It's about being accepted or not being accepted. It's about losing and the consequence of losing. It's about getting it wrong and being found out to be defective. It's about, it's about feeling that something will be so overwhelming that you will die, that you'll cease to exist, that it will erase you. It's about, at its most profound, it's about death and annihilation. It's about fear of I won't be able to survive this loss, this embarrassment, this shame, this isolation, this whatever it is. It's all that stuff right. That we come from as children, as helpless infants, every one of us, and that we build up all these layers of experience and personality and skill. But those early experiences persist. They're still there. And kind of like the nail or the penny that you put into a sapling and then the tree grows around it, it forms the shape of the thing that's around it. because of the thing buried inside. We're the same. So our early experiences, we layer all of our competence and adultness and whatever else and the mask on top of it, but those things continue to shape us. And that's what ultimately this is about. It's where those things get in the way, where
So,
those things give us an immunity and stop us from doing things. That's what this is about. It's about uncovering that.
mm. I mean, if I went out in the street and asked 100 people, why, you walked into 100 boardrooms and you say, well, why are you doing the things you're doing when you know, and that you know that they're sabotaging you and they're making you angry and you know you want to change, but you just don't seem to be able to change when it comes time to it, or the moment passes, as you say, and you're like, I said to myself, I'd never let that happen again. And there it is happening again. If I went out and talked to other people, I don't think many of them would say, fear of death or was what went on in my childhood. There'd be something more at a, let's say, at a more superficial level.
Yeah.
What what do those more superficial layers look like for people? Like I'm guessing, like when you kind of start digging into people, you're peeling back layers with people, but at that surface layer, what maybe it's a behavioral thing. I mean, how does this manifest in a team or in a group?
Like it's interesting. I did a lot of my training in Gestalt, and there's a model in Gestalt psychotherapy about layers of the self, and the outermost layer they call cliche, and it's a little bit of, I think it's cliche. Yeah, and it's all the mask stuff. It's how I'm meant to behave and how I'm meant to portray myself, given the context that I'm in. So if I'm in a boardroom and I'm a high-powered executive, well, then I put on the high-power executive mask and hat and suit and clothes, and I act that way. And I say, well, I didn't speak up then because it wasn't the right time. I actually have a different strategy, or the politics were against me, or like there'd be a million different reasons why. And all of it's kind of post hoc rationalization, which is fine. Like, and some of it might even be true. This is about, though, when these patterns persist and they start to get in the way, that's where it's like, okay, well, those now are starting to sound a lot like excuses, not reasons. And this is a rationalization, not a rationale. And so then that's kind of where that stuff, and then in this Gestalt model of layers, the next one would be, I think, role. It's so like I'm a father or I'm an executive. It's about identity, and then you're appealing to a large set of socially agreed norms around, well, and this is how one of those looks, and so I'm going to do that, and eventually you get down to the next kind of chunk of the layers of the self, and you get to what they call the phobic layer, which is what I'm afraid of and what I'm reacting against and what I'm pushing against. And typically that's where this work starts. This work starts at that kind of phobic layer of I'm not that. It's the definition of self in opposition to. And this is where all the stuff I'm afraid is true, or I'm not going to get, or the bad thing that's going to happen, that's where all that stuff lives.
That's really interesting, because what I'm hearing there is you're cutting through story.
Yes, that's very true. That's exactly what it's like. Cutting through, you know, encouraging people to look underneath. Yeah.
And so these are these personal languages that we spoke of, but then you're about to launch into, and I did interrupt, so I apologize, but there you were then about to talk into you're about to talk about like this another sequence or another model, or there was something else there.
Well, if I remember what we were doing, if there's the four steps, so if it's what do I want? What's my problem? What do I want? If the second then is what's my 50%. The third
Mm.
is but what am I doing instead? And if the fourth is because of my big assumption, then the fifth would be, well, how can I test this? How can I test my big assumption? And how can I test my competing commitment? This way I'm keeping myself safe? How can I test that? And that's the bit we've added. It's implied certainly in a lot of Keegan's stuff, but we've just been a bit more formal about it. And that's where we help people move into essentially small graded experiments. A graded experiment is it's kind of like steps. Take little steps, small steps, small steps. And so, if you've got a phobia of spiders, you don't jump into a tank full of spiders right away. You start by imagining a spider, and then you imagine two spiders. It's like small graded experiments before you launch yourself into. But the fifth step there would be, how can the individual experiment in a way that feels safe with doing things a bit differently and seeing what happens? Now that this kind of architecture of self-protection has been revealed, how could they start to test the various bits that it all rests on to see if that's true? To see if it's still true, for instance, that if I speak my mind in this meeting, everyone will think I'm a dickhead and will hate me. Is that true? What happens if you speak your mind? What happens if you speak part of your mind? What happens if you, is this thing that you're imagining is going to happen, does it actually happen? And then that's sort of testing your competing commitment. I must stay silent so I don't look like an idiot. And then the next one, the big assumption piece, would be, because if I were to look like an idiot, well, then I will lose everything and that will be unsupportable. And it's like, okay, so then let's imagine you do speak up and somebody, or maybe even everybody, thinks you're an idiot. Do you actually lose everything? And does it all go horribly, horribly, irreparably wrong? Or do they just think you're an idiot? And that's it. And it doesn't matter. So it's
occurs.
So that's the experimentation piece.
So it occurs to me that if you're going to do this in a group, you're going to do this in an executive group, these things they come with a history. They come with dynamics that are pre-existing. How do you? Well, seems to me that you'd need a certain degree of safety, right? Like, people are not, like, if people are afraid of looking like a fool, then they need some kind of evidence that that's not going to happen to them in order to facilitate, to make it easier for them. So I guess what I'm getting at here is,
why would
it
you
feels,
do it?
Yeah, why would you risk it?
Why the hell would you ever do it?
Right? Like, you've got your job. Like, why would you risk it? Right? And I guess that's the thing. Like, it makes perfect rational sense. Like, people are often and I've heard this so many times. Keep your head down. Don't cop any flack. Don't get shot. Do what you need to do by the higher ups and those around you. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I guess then, well, maybe my question here is then, why should people care about this?
Well, they shouldn't. So we're not advocating, we're not shoulding, we're not. So it's got to be a choice, right? And the point is, the person will stay stuck until that becomes too painful, until that becomes the problem. So I'm not saying they should. Don't. Stay where you are. It's working. Fine. Stay there. If, however, you're getting the experience of missing out on whatever, if you're having, like, power or agency or achievement or joy or not being in fear all the time or whatever it is, if you're having the experience, then that's when you would want to move to get yourself unstuck. So if you're feeling stuck, this is amazingly powerful and really efficient and very effective at getting unstuck. If you don't mind being stuck, stay stuck.
Now, it occurs to me, so far we've kind of spoken about at the individual level. And I could imagine that there's a whole bunch of, let's be honest, the vast majority of businesses and teams out there do stay in that safety zone, whereas, but that has an impact, right? So, because simultaneously I've seen people at every level of an organization pulling their hair out because things aren't changing or or there's too much change and they can't handle it. And it has an organizational impact. So if I put myself in the shoes of a senior executive and you got to move because there's a lot that's changing right now, everything from energy, like how the energy shift, you've got cyber, you've got geopolitics if you're doing, well, not even if you're international, but definitely if you're international, you've got supply chain, you've got climate, you've got shifts in society, you've got economic woes, all of these things are like, you got to move, you got to adapt. And so if your team and more importantly, the organization as a whole has this kind of resistance to change, that, well, it's an existential threat, right? At that level. So, what's your advice? What's at stake for senior leaders if they let this immunity to change just persist?
I think there's lots of leadership and executive competency frameworks that would talk about something similar to this around adaptability or nimbleness or agility of whatever sort, in terms of like a characteristic or a competency of an individual. At an executive level, you want people to be able to process and then change how they operate, change what they're doing, innovate, how they organize, etc. Let alone new products, new services, new markets, new ways of dealing, the stuff that you were talking about. So the idea of responsiveness versus reactiveness, I think, is relevant here. You want people with capability to apply to solve problems. They need to be responsive to the shifting environment, not fixed, not static, not rigid, not stuck in expert or expertise, not wedded to their one way and the right way and it's their way or my way. Like, none of that's going to work. And I think the things that you're talking about, the interconnection of all of that, all these different crises, the polycrisis, whatever we're going to call it, means that no one individual period can solve those problems. You need to create the bigger brain. This is kind of what we're on about, is necessary to deal with that level of complexity. You need people working together. You need collaboration. You need a bigger intelligence, not just one person's intelligence. And so if people are stuck in particular ways of operating and they don't have the self-awareness of their own patterns, it's almost impossible to create that bigger brain. You cannot get people working together optimally when those parts of those individuals remain fixed or rigid or stuck. And so I think that's the cost. The cost for a more senior person is the integration of the whole. The cost to the senior person is they won't be able to deal. It's kind of like having lesions in your brain. If it's like bits that won't work, you'll keep on running into the same blockage, and that blockage might be in a person, or it might be in a relationship between two people, whatever. But it means that bigger intelligence, that bigger brain, won't be functioning as well as it could, or maybe as well as it needs to. So that's why I care about it. If you have individuals who are rigid or fixed, you're unlikely to be able to deal with the problems you're going to have to deal with. And that will come at a significant cost.
So I guess that's a good segue. Immunity to change is a strong component, core component of the adaptive capacity index that we put together. how does the ACI help organizations or, at least exec teams broach this issue?
Well, I think it does so probably in two ways. We've asked questions of people to give their perspective. It's not the truth, it's their perspective on others functioning in the team. And we've sought to describe ways that we think indicate individuals being able to get themselves unstuck, i.e., embracing change, i.e., not being stuck, not being immune. So they're going to have information to discuss about each other's perspectives on what's our mental agility here, what's our embracing of change, what's our ability to be agile. Do we think we are, or do some of us think we are and other ones don't, or do we all agree that none of us are? And so there's going to be the coordinating of those perspectives, and then presumably if people go, yeah, we're actually all pretty fixed, we're all pretty in our own way, well, then you should probably do something about that. And so then they would do something. They would do a development program. They'd go off to therapists. They do whatever they're going to do to get unstuck. Fine. But also, I think just by dint of going through the process of putting all of these things on the table, of putting all of this stuff on the table and saying, right, as an executive team, we're going to have a different conversation than we've had before, where we've just been talking probably about it, the results, the system, the market, the marketing, whatever. We're going to talk about us, and we're going to talk about how we're making meaning of this and how we're operating together or not. And we're going to have that conversation. Are we up to the task of us? Now, most executive teams will find that in and of itself bumping up against their immunity to change, because it probably isn't how they normally do business, and it probably isn't the stuff they talk about. So merely putting it on the table and saying, we're going to talk about this, everybody's immunity to change will immediately be triggered. So it's like, no, I don't want to talk about that. No, we're not going to talk about that. We don't. So now suddenly everybody's having an immediate experience of their own blocks, and they go, right, I just got freaked out by that, or that made me feel really nervous, or now I feel very exposed, or whatever. Now I'm really annoyed. And so the doing of the ACI and its process will inevitably trigger people's immunities to change, and if handled well, will help them process it, will help them move through it. I mean, otherwise they just kind of have a tantrum, throw it up and say,
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about this.
Yeah. When I think about a lot of the other, let's say, tools or instruments, or just generally how we talk about things, we tend to talk in the abstract. We tend to talk about the out there, some claim on objective truth. And I don't think we really spend much time, for all the reasons that you've mentioned, on actually talking about how we're talking together, as in actually reflecting on the nature of the conversation that is going on between us and how we truly feel, or even like what's coming up for us. It's almost it's a social faux pas. You just, keep it objective, be rational, all the rest, which to be honest, I enjoy. That's great. But you also see a habits of interaction that form and become cemented throughout time that are serving neither party. But at the end of the day, until you actually have something to come in and perturb the system, like the ACI or some courageous person saying, I feel like we're kind of missing each other, or, actually just expressing how they feel this conversation, or even how they express how they feel the conversation is going, or actually express that to the other person. Until they have an experience like that, which those are quite rare, we just go through the motions. So we're just adding more. We haven't changed the operating system. of the conversation.
Yeah, look, I agree. If I understand you correctly, I think there is a kind of instrumentality that is valorized within a lot of management uh, teaching and education and books and certainly practice. And so the idea of we're going to talk about it, and that's actually the what we're supposed to do here is kind of that thing that I talked about right at the very beginning. It's like leave all that other shit at the door. Doesn't belong here. Where this is a place to talk about it. And what what that whole attitude, I mean, and it's quite a defended, shut down way of operating anyway. But what that attitude fails to acknowledge is that there is no it. The it itself is fictitious, that all you really have is interactions between people, and every one of those is an attempt at sense making. Where I had a conversation with a colleague earlier today about Carl Weick and his research into sense making, and he presents this in opposition to that attitude you just talked about the instrumentality of and the mechanized thinking. And his proposition is, well, there is no organization, it's organizing. We organize each other in the doing of things. There is no such thing as organization. And he always puts everything into a verb because it's people doing stuff, and it's
Yeah.
about sense making, and that is all of what we're doing. That is the job. The job is to make sense of something, make a decision, and do something.
Mm.
That's the job. And all this is kind of beside the point.
Yeah.
So
What is that phrase? Is a quote by Alfred Whitehead. N- Something along the lines of the something about misplaced. What is it? The misplaced trust in. I forget the quote. I'm murdering it. But I guess what I'm getting at here is that we humans are not things; they are beings. And what I mean by that, we're not nouns, we're verbs. We're not static, we are doing, and we're not isolated, we're connected. And in fact, you could also, and I love what you just said, that an organization isn't a noun, it's a verb, right? It's an emergent thing of a bunch of people getting together or a bunch of beings getting together and doing stuff together. And
yeah,
out of that comes this decision making system that does stuff in the world, and that ultimately is a more realistic depiction of what it is. And so, if we frame each other as things, or we frame organizations as things, as opposed to what they more realistically are, which are these things in motion that are constantly evolving, that are full of interrelated conversations, relationships, and actions that are taking place, we run the risk of not we run the risk of thinking that things are as we see them in any particular moment, as opposed to this ongoing process. And if we can then switch to a more process way of framing the world, thinking about the world, interacting with the world, suddenly that opens up the opportunity for shift, for change, right? For evolution, for
yeah.
creation.
Well, look, I think that the embracing change piece, the immunity to change practice, it's a profoundly humanistic turn. It repositions the work of any organization as being how the people show up into it. And it acknowledges that every one of us, has ongoing work to do from the beginning to the end, maintain and improve ourselves. When I talked earlier about Keegan and his proposition around adult development, so the job of all of us really as we get older is to operate with greater effectiveness and integrity and um, presumably to get something of good purpose done in the world. Our meaning making systems will change, and our sense making systems will change. And so this is the immunity to change process is in micro what one of those moves from level to level is about. It's taking what I was previously in, and it's making it from subjective to objective. It's allowing me to look at myself, to understand the turns I go through, to understand the fears that I maybe dimly articulated before, but now I've articulated quite clearly and I can see. I take what I was in, that response, that unconscious operating, and I make it objective. I pull it out and I can look at myself and I can go, that's what I was doing. That's who I am. And that move of taking what was subjective and making it objective, that move of self-awareness, that is moving up the levels. That is moving further along the adult development road. That subjective to objective move. And so it is practicing that muscle. One of my clients kind of coined the term, and it's really stuck with me. It's grow up to show up. It's adult development, higher levels of thought, higher levels of functioning in order to show up and do the work, to show up, have the conversation, to show up, tell the truth, and get it done.
But what happened? Yeah, right. So okay, you've done this with a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals for a long time. When people can make that shift, yeah, and as you say, it's a continual journey. Got that. But once people make that, what does it look like?
Well, so people will have articulated, named, spotted the fears that have kept them stuck. They've experimented enough and realized that maybe some of their fear is not founded in reality, and they start doing things differently. So you have meetings where previously it would have been pretty boring and everyone just would have nodded and or been making doodles or whatever, and then you get one or two people who stop and go, actually, I don't agree, or challenge the agenda and say, I don't think we're talking about the right things. I think there's something going on over here that we need to be talking about and doing something about. Or they might bring a problem to the table and say, hey, look, I know I'm accountable for this thing. It's not working. I don't know if I'm running it wrong or if it's poorly designed. I want to bring it to us and I want your help. You get all sorts of things starting to happen that isn't the pattern. So people spontaneously are beginning to innovate in both process as well as content. They will bring forth the things that they're interested in, that they think are important, that they would either have not brought, buried, avoided, not admitted to. And so you get a bit of disruption. You know, the meetings won't go for the 2 hours they're supposed to go for. Maybe they blow out to 4 hours, or the agenda that you thought so there can be a bit of chaos in the first bit around, because people are actually now operating as adults more than they were before. They're seeking to get what they want. They're perhaps being more of a push into the system. That's what it looks like. It also looks like innovation. It also looks like persistent problems, repeated patterns of system failure get put on the table and maybe get fixed.
Look, that thing you just said around somebody who's in charge of something, they've got the accountability and responsibility for it, and then having the courage to bring it to the table and say, hey guys, I'm in charge of this, and guess what? I don't think it's working. Maybe it's me. Can somebody help? I mean, that's a level of vulnerability. That's scary as hell for a lot of businesses. But I also think about, my goodness, how many people out there sitting on a project that ain't flying, but for the fear of looking dumb or for the fear of not looking like you're capable enough, you hide it, and until things all really fall apart in a giant catastrophe, and then you start finger pointing and blaming other people, and that's the story I've heard so many times. If you really knew what it was like going on in here, it's held together with sticky tape and chewing gum, because and that continues. And I'm just thinking of some of the bigger cases of Boeing's a good example, right, where they kind of silence that there was a cultural shift inside of the organization. Apparently, um, people became financially obsessed. Many years later, suddenly doors start falling off planes in the middle. Why? Because people didn't want to bring these concerns to the fore and actually say, I'm responsible about this. I need help.
Yeah.
I don't think
Look,
it's going to work.
there are so many examples. It's laughable. And each time something happens, it gets kind of presented as oh my God, how did that ever happen? It's like, because the same thing's been going on forever, everywhere. This is no longer should be a surprise. But yes, I think you said earlier, why would a senior executive care? Why should they care about this? Um, even if they're only the most mercenary of characters, having people play this game with themselves and therefore in business is costing that business huge amounts of money. If that's it, that's
Yeah.
there's it, that's could be enough to
Well, I think
why should I care about this?
there's another layer here, and it is that the degree of change and transformation that businesses are going through right now and need to go through, even if they're aware of it or not. Like we mentioned all before, right? So energy transition. Like I don't think enough, let's say COOs and other people just generally in an organization understand the degree to which this changes how you actually need to operate your business. And it's climate and it's economy and it's all of these things. What that means then is that there is a significant pressure to innovate, evolve, cut bad processes, fail early, fail fast, and recover early. All of that, um, and as you're talking about, like with this immunity to change thing, like if people don't, I mean, the change right now, people always say, well, change is the only constant. Yeah, true. Change isn't the problem; it's rate of change, and the rate of change that organisations need to go through this decade is it boggles the mind, and I'm not sure the degree to which they're aware of it. So,
Yeah, look,
I think
I don't know either, and I think that's part of the ongoing. Look, people will agree and get on some bus, or they will disagree and say no, it's not that much, whatever. I agree, though. That's what I think, and I think that the people that are not focusing on adaptive capacity, like what is our ability to adapt to a rapidly shifting environment, if they aren't thinking about that, I think they're not doing their job. Uh, and if that isn't the most important thing, then they're not looking after shareholder value because the company will go broke.
Hmm.
So it feels to me like it's just become the most basic part of their job has to be how much of this capability do we have? And if we don't have it, where don't we have it? And do something about it. Otherwise, it feels like it's negligent, really, and probably abuse of something, assets, or I'm not quite sure what the legal term of that would be. Um,
All
yes.
right. Well, look, we've come up to our time limit for this one. Uh, I just wanted to kind of throw in one question at the end here about, is there a tool, practice, resource, something that you would point leaders to who wanted to dive a bit deeper and learn a bit more about this?
Absolutely. So the book Immunity to Change by Robert Keegan and Lisa Lasko-Leahy is the obvious place to start. They walk you through how to do it on yourself and even how to do it they talk about a collective immunity to change, so like a cultural norm thing. So I think that's the best resource out there I would point to, besides ourselves, of course. So, we're always here to help, and obviously we have lots of experience in working with this, but as a book, it's a fantastic read. I think there's also another podcast It's Brene Brown's podcast. She has Lisa Lasko-Leahy on it, and Lisa takes Brene Brown through an immunity to change process. It's over 2 episodes, and it is brilliant. It's like a bit of a masterclass of somebody actually being taken through the process kind of live on air, and it is a masterful tool. So if they want to know more about it and kind of get a sense of what would it be like, that's a great way to have a listen and get some insight.
Sure thing. Well, thanks. I guess the only other thing, another easy way you can do that, and about 12 other things with the ACI. So, that's the other option for people, is just run that on your exec team. We'll tell you all that and 11 other things at the same time.
Shameless plug number 3.
Yeah. So you go do what you got to do. Thanks for your time, Brent.
Yeah. Thank you.